Chapter 19 of The Apostle of Alaska. The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. Arctander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. First Fruits. In February 1859, Mr. Duncan thought it safe to move the school back to the house he had built for it, and dividing the pupils into different classes, he found himself able to make better progress than before in instructing them. Every session of the school was opened with prayer and a short address on a passage or narrative from the Bible. Then he would make the whole school learn a text in English, which he explained and paraphrased, and which they repeated again and again until it was firmly fixed in their minds. Singing was a very popular part of the school work. Simple hymns were translated into their language, and old and young were very much interested in learning them. Gradually, the little crowd who gathered around the Word every Sunday increased, and those who had come from the beginning seemed to become more and more interested. The influence of the Gospel showed itself in many of them. It was especially observable in those who attended the school. Week by week, there was a fewer number who came to school painted in the heathen way, or with abominable rings or ornaments in their noses or lips. Soon it was also clearly perceivable that the drunken brawls in the camp were on the decrease. Some of the chiefs had already let it be known that they would abandon their medicine work, and one thing was certain, that the heathenish rites were not carried on with the same spirit and dash as heretofore. One could notice that a feeling of shame had taken possession of the common people when taking part in the ceremonies, instead of the braggadocio which theretofore was one of the concomitants of the medicine and club work. No better proof that the teaching of the Gospel was taking effect, and that the Word reached the hearts and consciences of the people, can be found than the conduct of a bad man, who was present at a service, and who finally went away muttering, and later was heard to talk badly against Mr. Duncan. His trouble was that he was firmly convinced that Mr. Duncan was speaking about him, and had been telling the people his bad ways, and thus shamed him. At a meeting held by several chiefs in Leggaik's house in March, just before the departure of the main body of the people for the oolakan fishing at Nass River, it was resolved to send word from them to Mr. Duncan that they hoped he would keep on to speak strong against the bad ways of their people, and they would also support him with strong speeches. But more than mere talk was it, when the head chief, Leggaik himself, on the 6th of April, came to the school, this time not to kill the teacher, but in order to sit at his feet and learn about the good ways. This example was soon followed by many, and during the year 4 or 5 other chiefs diligently attended school. In August, the following event took place. One Cushwaht had been bitten by a dog belonging in the fort. According to the Indian custom, he was to take out his revenge on one of the whites, and as Mr. Duncan was the only one he could conveniently get at, he went in his rage to the schoolhouse to kill him. As he found the door locked, he smashed it, cut out the lock, and destroyed some books and other property. It was really the time for Mr. Duncan to be at school, but fortunately for him, he had been called to see an old Indian woman, who was suffering from peritonitis. He told her that he had to go to the fort to consult his books, and to mix some medicine for her. As he stood in his room rolling some pills, which he had prepared in magnesia, 2 Indians came rushing in. They were very much excited, brought with them the piece which had been cut out of the door, and begged of him not to go outside the fort, as Cushwaht had sworn that he would kill him. One of them, an old man, one of the first to come out to his services, begged him, with tears in his eyes, not to show himself outside the fort that day. But Mr. Duncan was immovable. He had promised the old woman to come and see her again. She would expect him. He felt that it was his duty to keep his promise, that God would protect him in the discharge of his duty, and he went on his way. As he left the fort, the Indians shouted after him, "If Cushwaht kills you, we will kill him." He had to pass near Cushwaht's house in going to see the old woman. He went by with his head erect, whistling in a careless manner. He imagined he saw some one moving inside the door, but nothing happened. While he was in his patient's house, a woman came in. It was Cushwaht's wife. He noticed that she crossed the floor, and observed him very closely. He looked up, cast a careless glance in her direction, and went on with his work. Later on, he found that she had been sent to see whether he appeared scared or flustered. If he had so appeared, the Indian would have killed him, without doubt. That was their way. If he was not afraid, then the Indian did not dare to attack him, as Duncan's spirit would then have been on top. On coming out, the idea occurred to him to go directly past the house, as there were some other sick people farther away, whom he might visit now, when there was to be no school in the afternoon. But then it came to him, "No, you have no duty to go there. God will protect you in the discharge of your duty, but not when you recklessly run into danger." So he turned and went back to the fort. Nothing happened. He paid no attention to what Cushwaht had done, only put on a new lock, and went about his usual business. And now was apparent the change which had come over the hearts of the Indians during the last half year. He had used his strongest powers of persuasion to keep them from taking measures of revenge against Cushwaht for doing what he had against him, and for threatening his life. That all days of danger, however, were not yet over, is shown by the following incident. Mr. Duncan, who had noticed that the Indian children never played or laughed, or even smiled, determined to get his school children to have some innocent amusement, as well as instruction. He therefore, in November, after the potatoes had been dug from the garden at the fort, secured the captain's permission to use a portion of this garden for a playground for his scholars, and erected on it a greased pole, with a cap on top, which was to belong to the boy who could first get hold of it. They had quite a time of it, some of the old people gathering to look at the contest, as well as quite a lot of children too small to take part. As it was cold, and the children were scantily dressed, he was afraid that the little ones, who were just looking on, were getting chilly, so he proposed that they run after him, and, to the one who would catch him, he promised to give a piece of soap. The little children, who already had become quite attached to the kind, loving schoolmaster, started to run. One of them stumbled and fell. Some of the others laughed at the clumsiness of the little tot, who was foolish enough to cry at the mishap. Mr. Duncan noticed a commotion over in the crowd of people, but did not know till it was all over what was up. Loocoal, the father of the child, a medicine man, who had no love for Mr. Duncan, then or afterwards, angry at his child having been shamed, and using the Indian logic that it would not have happened had not Mr. Duncan asked them to run after him and catch him, had lifted his gun, pointed it at Mr. Duncan, and undoubtedly would have killed him then and there, had it not been for his own nephew, who grabbed hold of the muzzle of the gun, pushed it to the ground, and held it there, till others could disarm the outraged medicine man. Loocoal was, some years later, killed by this very nephew. The following summer, Mr. Duncan, at the joint request of Bishop Hills, of the Diocese of Columbia, and of Governor Douglas, spent a couple of months, while his Indians were away on their fishing trips, at Victoria, where it was thought he could be of great assistance in helping to organize a movement to control and Christianize the Indian camps near Victoria, where many of the up-coast Indians came for trading and worse purposes. He showed his ability as an organizer in this work. His plans were fully approved by the authorities, and could he himself have been permitted to carry them out, they would unquestionably have proven of great benefit. But the people afterwards chosen to carry them into execution unfortunately did not have the requisite courage, and the work fell through, after Mr. Duncan had left for the Northland with Rev. L. S. Tugwell, a missionary, who, upon Duncan's repeated requests upon the Society to send him a married missionary, in order that the Indians might be taught Christian home life, had, with his young wife, been sent out from England, and arrived in Victoria in the month of August, 1860. Mr. Duncan, of course, started for Fort Simpson with his new assistants on the first steamer going north. On arriving at the fort, he addressed Mrs. Tugwell. "Now don't bother about the luggage, Mrs. Tugwell. Your husband and I will look after that. But we have no bread in the house. Will you kindly make us some biscuits? You will find the flour over there." "Why, Mr. Duncan," was her answer, "I don't know how to make biscuits. I have never made any biscuits in all my life." One can hardly blame Mr. Duncan when he, of late, in speaking of this incident, said, "What do you think of that? The Church Missionary Society had sent more than 5,000 miles someone to help me to teach Indians Christian home life, and here I was, obliged to make bread for her myself, the very first day she was in my house." It is only fair, however, to say that Mrs. Tugwell, for the little more than a year that she and her husband spent at Fort Simpson, proved of much greater value than her first day's lack of usefulness would seem to give promise of. As the accommodations in the fort now had become wholly inadequate, Mr. Duncan concluded to build a dwelling house outside, where he placed in charge of Mrs. Tugwell some of the older schoolgirls, who were getting to an age when they required a Christian mother's care, and some one to look after them all the time, and this position Mrs. Tugwell, to the best of her ability, filled with great zeal and Christian earnestness. In the month of April, 1860, Mr. Duncan had undertaken a journey up the Nass River in order to carry the gospel tidings to the Tsimshean tribes there, but as he was not, at the time, able to get to the upper villages, and now had been authorized by the governor to warn all the tribes in the northwestern part of the province against bringing their young women to Victoria, he, after returning to Fort Simpson with the Tugwells, made another tour up Nass River, on which trip he visited all the different villages located up that great stream. On going away from the fort on canoe trips, he always took with him, for paddlers, some young boys of his scholars. If he had one adult for counsel as to navigation, which he deemed safest, he always made it a point to choose an old man, whom he could expect to be able to overpower, should he attack him for the purpose of robbery. That was the extent of confidence he yet had in the Indians. So much had been preached to him by the fort people of their treachery. On this trip, he was happily surprised as to the character of the old man he had taken along. He says himself: "One night, when I was camping out, after a weary day, the supper and the little instruction being over, my crew of Indians, excepting one old man, quickly spread their mats near the fire, and lay down to sleep, in pairs, each sharing his fellow's blanket. The one old man sat near the fire, smoking his pipe. I crept into my little tent, but after some time put my head outside to see that all was right. The old man was just making his bed, a thin bark mat on the ground, a little box of grease, and a few dried salmon for his pillow, a shirt on, and a blanket around him, another bark mat over all, his head included. When everything was adjusted, he put his pipe down, and offered up, in his own tongue, this simple little prayer: 'Be merciful to me, Jesus.' Then he drew his feet up, and was soon lost to view." Methinks Mr. Duncan had no fear of any attempt at robbery on the part of this old man after that day. The reception which he met with at one of the upper villages, on his second trip up Nass River, is so unique that it must be told, as I heard him tell it one day, in the church at Metlakahtla, to a party of tourists. But I desire to preface the narrative with the remark that not only had the news of Mr. Duncan's preaching the gospel at the lower villages the foregoing spring reached these tribes, but more than that, the tale of the wonderful influence which he had already exercised over so many of the Fort Simpson Indians had undoubtedly penetrated into the interior, and filled these savage hearts with awe and wonderment. On the 8th day of September, Mr. Duncan started from the uppermost of the lower villages on the Nass River on his journey upstream. The current in this river is so rapid that it is almost impossible to make much headway unless a man acquainted with the eddies of the river is at the helm. Mr. Duncan, therefore, with thanks, accepted the generous offer of Kintsada, the chief, to pilot him on his trip. Soon after he had arrived at Aquilaka's village, and had encamped on the river bank, messengers from the chief came to tell him that the chief's house was not in order just then, but that he was going to arrange it right away, and then would send many messengers to him to tell him to come. After an hour or so, several persons came down to the river bank, in state, to invite him to come to the chief's house, and be present at his dance. Mr. Duncan was shocked, and told the messengers that he had not come to participate in a dance, that his errand was too solemn a one for that. The messengers retired, but soon came back with word from the chief, that if the white chief would not come to his dance, he would not come to the white chief's talk, but that, if he came, the chief and all his people would come and listen to him. Mr. Duncan still had some scruples about going. The idea of a missionary proceeding to a dance had something abhorrent in it to him. But when the young chief finally came himself and explained to him that a dance, with them, meant just the same as the book with the white people, whatever he may have meant by this, Duncan concluded that he had better give in for once, and so went with his crew to the chief's house. Upon entering, he said, I was with many ceremonies shown to a box, which had been placed for me, covered with an expensive fur, in front of a sail doing service as a curtain. There were many people in the house. Over to one side sat a number of women, who later on acted as a chorus. I looked just as glum as I knew how. I was not going to smile at their dancing anyhow, and felt half inclined to turn back, even after I had been seated. Soon a man with a long staff in his hand stepped out in front of the curtain. He made a respectful bow to me and said, "Welcome, Chief." As another man came out and placed himself by his side, he commenced a sort of improvised chant. "Are the heavens going to change the hearts of our old men now?" he chanted, striking the time with his staff. "Perhaps so," the other man answered. The choir now fell in, asserting that the heavens were going to change the hearts of their people, when suddenly the curtain was drawn aside, and the young chief, arrayed in a beautiful suit, stepped forward with very graceful movements, struck an exceedingly imposing attitude right in front of me, saluted me, and then looked up to the bit of heaven showing through the opening in the centre of the ceiling, found in all Indian houses to let the smoke escape by, and, to my great amazement, instead of dancing, commenced to recite a most beautiful prayer. This is about what he said in his own sonorous, flowing language. "Pity us, great Father in heaven, pity us. Give us thy good book to do us good and clear away our sins. This chief has come to tell us about thee. It is good, great Father. We want to hear. Who ever came to tell our fathers thy will? No, no, but this chief has pitied us and come. He has thy book. We will hear. We will receive thy word. We will obey." Then he started a plaintive chant, sounding almost like a hymn. It was an improvisation of how the heavenly chief had taken pity on them, and sent the white chief to tell them the great truth. Every little while the chorus would repeat what he had sung. He then made a speech to me, offering me the glad hand of his people. In the afternoon the whole village came to my tent to hear me preach. Prominent among them was an old blind chief of the uppermost village on the river, Skloot by name, who was greatly impressed by the message, and repeated the glad tidings about Jesus again and again to the people, and told them that a change had now come over their hearts. He even started a prayer himself to Jesus to take his sins away. After supper, the chief from the lower village, who had acted as my pilot up the river, told me that the old blind chief would like to be allowed to come to my evening's devotion with my crew, which request was cheerfully granted. About 30 came with him. Hearing me singing Christian hymns took their hearts completely. I had to promise to teach them to sing the next day, which I did, trying to instruct them to sing "Jesus my Saviour" in their own language. In the afternoon many of the men came to me, and wanted me to write out, so that they could preserve it and always look at it, a pledge not to drink any intoxicating liquors any more. To this pledge they each attached their mark, folded it up carefully, and took it away with them. This was probably the first temperance meeting ever held on the banks of the Nass River. Some years later, a mission was started, under the direction of Mr. Duncan, by the Rev. R. A. Doolan, at Kincolith, the place of the scalps, at the mouth of the river. This mission was later on most successfully carried on by the Rev. R. Tomlinson, and later still by the Rev., now the Venerable Archdeacon, W. H. Collinson, who, together with his interesting family, still keeps the mission fire burning at this place. Returning to Fort Simpson, it is to be said that during the winter of 1860 and 1861 the attendance at the church was very encouraging, some 200 or 300 at every service, and this though there were 3 services every Sunday, 2 for adults and 1 for the children. As these services, as well as the school, were conducted in the native tongue, and as Mr. Tugwell did not seem to be able to make much headway in his study of the language, of course the burden of the work continued to rest on Mr. Duncan's shoulders. But the mere presence of a sympathizing co-worker, and the encouraging words and cordial sympathy of a good earnest Christian brother, were thoroughly appreciated by him, and undoubtedly gave more strength than the mere taking of the burden of work from his shoulders could have done. What he experienced in his solitude, both before this time and later on, when disappointments came in his work, when he saw one or another fall back into sin, and his heart was faint, we can easily imagine. He has himself told me that many a night, when he felt faint and discouraged, he, before closing his eyes, ardently implored God to never let him see another day. The Lord always hears the prayers of his children, it is said, So he did in this case, but in his own way. He did not answer the prayer to take his servant home in his sleep, but he heard it by giving him greater strength to do the day's work, and by sending now and then great encouragement, so that he could plainly perceive that it was the Lord's work he was allowed to do. The attendance at the school this winter was from 100 to 150 children, and from 40 to 50 adults. On New Year's Day, the first school feast among the natives was held. Soup, rice, and molasses were served to an assembly of over 250, and speeches, singing, and games were greatly enjoyed by all present. During the 2nd and 3rd weeks of January, Mr. Duncan again called at the houses of the different chiefs, and in the evening held preaching services, now here and then there, in order to reach those who had not come out to his regular meetings. During this fortnight, the Gospel was thus preached to 1,400 Indians all told. The schoolhouse had now become too small, and during the summer preparations were made to erect a building 76 by 36, to serve both as a church and a schoolhouse. For the first time, the Indians themselves contributed towards its cost, not only by giving their labour, but also by direct contributions in the way of baskets, carved spoons, and native dishes, which all found a ready market in Victoria as curios. At the first service after the new schoolhouse was opened, in the fall of 1861, upwards of 400 Indians attended, the largest congregation ever gathered together up to that time. Mr. Duncan had, for some time, carried on 2 weekly meetings for those who were candidates for baptism and inquirers for the truth. He considered this the most interesting part of his work, and had the pleasure of seeing them attended sometimes by as many as 40 earnest seekers for the eternal truth. In the month of October, the state of Mrs. Tugwell's health compelled the Tugwells to give up their work and return to England. Before leaving, Mr. Tugwell, on the 26th day of July, 1861, had the pleasure of receiving into the church, by the sacrament of baptism, 23 persons, 14 men, 5 women, and 4 children, the first fruits of the earnest and strenuous labours of Mr. Duncan among the Tsimsheans. Several others came forward asking baptism, but for several reasons, mainly because they did not seem advanced enough in instruction, they were advised to wait. Others, who desired baptism, and were fit for it, were at this time deterred from taking the step by fear of their fierce relatives. The only children baptized were those of Christian parents. While he remained in the Society's service, Mr. Duncan did not, himself, baptize the converts, as he was not an ordained minister. Only in a few isolated cases did he make an exception, in baptizing those who were dying, when no priest of the church could be reached. Mr. Duncan, at about this time, writes thus of the newly baptized: "Since these have come fairly out, there has been more of a persecuting spirit abroad from the Lord's enemies. This we may expect to be increased. The converts are severely tried and tempted at present, but we pray that they may be preserved faithful. While some have decided, and many, increasingly many, are anxious, others, the wicked, wax worse and worse. Drunkenness seems to gather strength as the facilities for it increase." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla, by John W. Arctander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. A Christian Village. As early as 1859, Mr. Duncan had come to the conclusion that if the work he was carrying on should have any permanent results, it would be necessary to remove those of the Indians who had become subject to the power of the gospel from the evil influences of the heathen homes and surroundings. And more important still, be it said to our shame, was it, in his judgment, to get them away from the degrading influence of the white people at the fort. It could not be expected that young people, especially, could remain steadfast in their faith, and in their determination to live clean Christian lives, when they were continually exposed to taunts and temptations on the part of parents and relatives. He therefore, for quite a while, had contemplated removal of those who had become interested in the gospel teaching to a new home, where they could start a model Christian village, keeping intoxicating liquors entirely away, worship God in their simple manner, without taunts from scoffers or mockers, and observe the Sabbath day as became true followers of the White Christ. One day, on talking with an old, venerable chief, and telling him that his object in teaching the children was to make them good and happy, he was surprised to hear the old man echo his own ideas by saying, "Well, if you want to make them good and happy, you will have to take them away from here." This remark gave him the courage to broach the subject to those who attended his services, and from this time on he incessantly urged upon his friends the necessity of taking steps soon for the removal to the proper locality, where they could start a village of their own. The converts, and others who were friendly to the Word, soon became convinced that this step was necessary, and the question now came to the fore, where would the proper place be for the Christian settlement? 2 or 3 different places were suggested by his adherents, but upon examination of them, Mr. Duncan came to the conclusion that Metlakahtla, situated 17 miles south of the fort, where these same tribes had had their old villages before removal to Fort Simpson, would be a model place. After visiting it in the spring of 1860, Mr. Duncan described it thus: "A narrow, placid channel, studded with little promontories and pretty islands. A rich verdure of waving forest, backed by lofty and densely wooded mountains. A solemn stillness, broken only by the cries of flocks of happy birds flying over, or the more musical note of some little warbler near at hand." What especially commended it to Mr. Duncan was the splendidly protected harbor, the fine beach, furnishing an excellent landing place for the canoes, and the fact that portions of the land on many of the promontories had already been cleared, and would furnish fine garden spots for the colonists. It was originally Mr. Duncan's plan to send Mr. and Mrs. Tugwell to Metlakahtla to take charge of the new settlement, while he was to remain at Fort Simpson and take trips around to the different settlements, and thus win a greater number of recruits for the cause, whom he could from time to time transfer to Metlakahtla. Contemplating a removal that year, he, during the summer, set to work, draining the ground which he had selected for the site of the new village. But Mr. Tugwell's intended departure delayed the carrying out of the project to the next spring, and, of course, necessitated Mr. Duncan himself taking charge of the new settlement. On the 14th of May, 1862, everything was in readiness for the removal. The large schoolhouse, which had been built with such a purpose in view, was taken down and put into a raft, and was sent towards its destination in charge of a number of men, who were to start the building of a temporary house for Mr. Duncan, and plant some potatoes at the new location. 2 days after the raft had started, a canoe from Victoria brought the sad news that an epidemic of smallpox had broken out there, and, in fact, it seemed as if the crew had brought the plague with them, as some of them had died on the way up. Before going away, Mr. Duncan had intended to speak a last word to all the Indian tribes. As the shadow of the fell disease was now upon them, he felt still more impelled at once to see them and warn them. He says, "I therefore spent the next few days in assembling and addressing each of the 9 tribes separately. Thus all in the camp again heard a warning voice. Many, alas, for the last time as it proved. Sad to relate, hundreds of those who heard me were soon and suddenly swept into eternity." On May 27, 1862, the departure came to pass. Mr. Duncan says, "In the afternoon we started off. All that were ready to go with me occupied 6 canoes, and we numbered about 50 souls, men, women, and children. Many Indians were seated on the beach, watching our departure with solemn and anxious faces. Some promised to follow us in a few days. The party with me seemed filled with solemn joy as we pushed off, feeling that their long-looked-for flitting had actually commenced. I felt that we were beginning an eventful page in the history of these poor people, and earnestly besought God for His help and blessing." They arrived at their new location the next afternoon at 2 o'clock, and at once set to work with a will building their new homes. Those who had gone before had already got all the lumber, except some extremely heavy beams, carried to its destination, had erected 2 temporary houses, and planted 50 bushels of potatoes. Every night, after the day's work was ended, the whole colony gathered on the beach, a happy family, for singing, evening prayer, and devotion. Mr. Duncan is a very methodical man. Before starting on this new enterprise, he had drafted the following rules, which every adult was required to pledge himself faithfully to live up to before he could become a member of this model community. The rules were simple but definite, and pledged each inhabitant: 1. To give up their Haliad, or Indian deviltry. 2. To cease calling in conjurers when sick. 3. To cease gambling. 4. To cease giving away their property for display. 5. To cease painting their faces. 6. To cease drinking intoxicating drinks. 7. To rest on the Sabbath. 8. To attend religious instruction. 9. To send their children to school. 10. To be clean. 11. To be industrious. 12. To be peaceful. 13. To be liberal and honest in trade. 14. To build neat houses. 15. To pay the village tax. These obligations may seem easy enough to us, but when we consider that the first 5 rules really required of these people the surrender of all their ancient national customs, which had, for ages, not only occupied their time, but had come to be looked upon with the veneration of religious rites, we can readily understand that to give them up all at once would seem to many of them like cutting off the right hand or plucking out the right eye. But Mr. Duncan had no idea of making the change an easy one for them. That is not his style. It was a change of heart he wanted. No half-hearted measures would do. No compromise with the devil or with the heathenish past could be tolerated for a moment. No wonder, therefore, that many quailed before the sacrifice and deemed it too severe. But strict as the requirements were, they did not deter those who were really in earnest. It was a small company which started away with Mr. Duncan that day, but what must have been their feelings when they, within a fortnight, on the 6th day of June, espied coming, dashing down the inlet, 30 canoes, loaded with 300 people, who were coming to join their fortunes with the happy family, which had gone before. If there were any faint hearts among the pioneers, would not such a sight make them cry with joy? Among the new arrivals was almost the whole Kitlahn tribe, with 2 chiefs. This must have been a great day for Mr. Duncan. He could now plainly see that his labours had, indeed, not been in vain. But he and his adherents were to be sorely tried. The awful smallpox plague soon after broke out, in full blast among the Indians at Fort Simpson. More than 500 of them died from the ravages of the fell disease, and though quarantine, as strict as possible under the circumstances, was maintained at Metlakahtla, the disease was, of course, brought there, and soon a great number of the newcomers fell victims to the plague. God's protecting hand, however, was over the community, and only 5 of the settlers in the new village died from the plague. One of this number was Stephen Ryan, one of the group baptized by Mr. Tugwell the year before. Mr. Duncan gives a touching account of his, Ryan's, last days. He died in a most distressing condition, as far as the body is concerned, away from everyone whom he loved, in a little bark hut on a rocky beach, just beyond the reach of the tide, which no one of his relatives dared approach, except the one who nursed him. In this damp, lowly, distressing state, suffering from the malignant disease, smallpox, how cheering to receive such words as the following from him: "I am quite happy. I find my Saviour very near to me. I am not afraid to die. Heaven is open to receive me. Give my thanks to Mr. Duncan. He told me of Jesus. I have hold of the ladder that reaches to heaven. All Mr. Duncan taught me, I now feel to be true." These words he wanted carried to his relatives. "Do not weep for me. You are poor, being left. I am not poor. I am going to heaven. My Saviour is very near to me. Do all of you follow me to heaven. Let not one of you be wanting. Tell my mother more clearly the way of life. I am afraid she does not yet understand the way. Tell her not to weep for me, but to get ready to die. Be all of one heart, and live in peace." Indeed, one such death was well worth all the sacrifices, all the loneliness which Mr. Duncan had gone through, and all that he was still to go through. And there were many, many more such deaths at Metlakahtla. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Apostle of Alaska. The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. Arctander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Shempf. Legaic. This man, the head chief of the Tsimshians, who, it will be remembered, once sought to take Mr. Duncan's life, but who later on attended school and seemed to come under the influence of the word, was not among those who first went to Metlakahtla. And this was hardly to be expected. To no man in all the tribes would moving to Metlakahtla and becoming a Christian mean so much as to Legaic. Mr. Duncan had, in his wisdom, found it necessary to do away with all chieftainship among the Christian Tsimshians. This, the very foundation for their heathen institutions, must be entirely eradicated before a new foundation could be laid. So his word was, "We recognize no chiefs among us, except those who excel in living upright Christian lives, and show that they are true sons of God." At Fort Simpson, Legaic was sought for one purpose and then another. He was looked up to and honored as the head chief of the nation. At Metlakahtla he would be as low as the lowest, no higher than the lowest, until his life showed that he was a true and exemplary Christian. The government of the village was, and of course had to be, in the hands of Mr. Duncan. He could brook no chiefs beside him, certainly none above him. The only assistants he had, in the beginning of the life of the new village, were 12 native constables, who had to see that peace was maintained, that no strangers coming among them misbehaved, and that the people of the village lived proper Christian lives. It was their duty to report all misbehavior to Mr. Duncan. Later on, the number of constables was increased to 30, and a village council appointed, the membership varying in number from time to time. Each one of these officials was then given the supervision of 10 of the inhabitants, an arrangement similar to the class system in the Methodist Church. Legaic's tribe seemed to have suffered more in proportion than any other from the ravages of the smallpox epidemic. This visitation brought him to his senses, and sent him with his family to Metlakahtla, where for a while he seemed to try hard to live an humble and consistent Christian life. But every now and then messengers came to him from the Fort Simpson Indians. He was wanted there for this and for that. When an Indian had a feast, or had built, or was about to build, a new house, or was to have a potlatch, he did not feel that the festivities were complete without Legaic's presence. Legaic once asked Mr. Duncan what he should do about this, whether he could not go over and help them sometimes. Mr. Duncan's answer was, "No, you should not go. You have to be one thing or the other." It was the same old rule, no compromise with the devil, no half-heartedness. After a while, Legaic got so that he wanted to be friends with both sides, and his talk, as reported to Mr. Duncan, threatened to cause bad blood among the people of Metlakahtla. Mr. Duncan sent for him, and said to him, "Legaic, you had better leave here and go back to Fort Simpson. I don't want you here. You are wearing the mantle on both shoulders. You want to serve both God and the devil, and you are doing the devil's work here. You had better leave here and go back, for your heart is there with the heathen, and where you can be a chief." There was nothing for him to do after that but to leave. He knew Mr. Duncan, but he was a chief, a great chief, and it would never do for him to admit that he had been sent away. So, before he pushed his canoe off from the beach, he made the crowd a little speech, in which he told them that he had to go away, that he knew he was doing wrong, and probably would be very sorry for it some time, but his friends over there were too strong for him, and pulled him away. How did these new Christians act? Shrug their shoulders and say, "Just what I told you. It was just what I expected that he could not stand. I am not surprised at all." No, that is the way among many whites who pretended to be good Christians. Not so with these people. As his canoe scraped against the sand, they knelt down on the beach and prayed God that He would speak to his heart, and not allow him to turn away from his Heavenly Father. And then some of them hastened to Mr. Duncan to tell him that Legale had gone. They must have been surprised indeed when he answered them, "Yes, I know it. I told him to go." "What? Send Legale away, the head chief? Not care to keep him in the village?" A little meditation, perhaps, made Mr. Duncan grow ahead or more in their estimation, but for that he did not care. It was late at night, the third day thereafter, when Mr. Duncan heard a knock at the door of his little cabin. When he opened it, he found Legale standing outside. He scanned his hands for a weapon. He was a little afraid that he had come back in the night for revenge, but he discovered nothing. Legale's eyes were cast down. "What do you want?" "I want to come in." "What do you want here?" "I want to talk with you." "All right, come in then." He looked dejected and broken-hearted, and walked and acted very diffidently and humbly. There was nothing of the proud chief about him now. When in the room, Mr. Duncan said, "So you have come back?" "I have come back." "Why did you, when I told you to go away?" "Because I could not help it. I have not slept for 3 nights. I have come back to say to you, tell me what to do, and I will do it. Tell me what not to do, and I will not do it. There is only one thing you must not tell me to do, for I will not do it." "What is that?" "Do not tell me to go away. I will not do it, for I cannot do it." Impressed by his earnestness, Mr. Duncan allowed him to come back, and he now became a truly humble, earnest seeker, and the following year was baptized, together with his wife and only daughter. In his baptism he, at his own request, received the name of Paul, and well might he, for he proved another Saul of Tarsus indeed. The man who once was ready to take Mr. Duncan's life now became known up and down the coast as his most ardent admirer and assistant. Once, and only once after that, did he fail in his duty, but Mr. Duncan gave him then such a good lesson that he never forgot it. The constables of the village were furnished with a cap, belt, and cape, as badges of office. Legale, who perhaps in this saw a distinction to make up for the loss of his chieftainship, asked Mr. Duncan if he would not appoint him a constable, and he readily assented. After a year or more, when he had found out that the office of constable did not only consist of wearing a cap, belt, and cape, but that there was considerable work connected with it, and sometimes even considerable danger, he came to Mr. Duncan, and he said he thought he would give it up. "All right," Mr. Duncan said. "It is wholly voluntary, you know. If you take no interest in it, I'll not have you." Legale told him that all the others wanted to give it up too. "What?" Duncan ordered him to stay right where he was, and at once sent for all the other constables. When they had arrived, and were all seated around the table in his office, he commenced. "I have heard that some of you are dissatisfied with your job, and want to give it up. If that is so, I want to know it. I don't want to force this honourable but dangerous office upon any one. It takes men with a heart for that business, and I want no one else. Let us now hear from each of you in turn. You, what do you say? Do you want to give up your cap and belt?" "No, sir, I don't want to. I never thought of such a thing." "And you, sir?" "No." And so all around to 9 of them. The 10th, who belonged to Legale's tribe, said, "I have poor health, sir. Sometimes great strength and endurance are required to discharge the duties of the office. I don't think I have that strength, and sometimes I have thought of giving it up." "All right, sir. You are right. Your health is rather poor, and I think myself it may be the best thing for you to make place for another man." The 11th answered a definite "No." "Now, as to you, Legale, I will not ask you. I want to say to you, sir, that you cannot be a constable any longer. I want your cap and belt and cape at once." A couple of months later, Legale's wife came around and told Mr. Duncan that he would very much like to get back on the force. He evidently missed the authority and distinction. "No, tell your husband that he has given it up once, and never can be a constable again, as long as he lives." This humiliation he took like a Christian, and never expressed any dissatisfaction with Mr. Duncan's decision. For several years he supported himself and family by working as a humble carpenter, and whenever he could say a word for the Master, who had conquered his proud and savage heart, he did not fail to do so. In 1864, he and Claw were present with Mr. Duncan at a meeting in the Indian camp at Fort Simpson. After Mr. Duncan had spoken, an old man got up and said that he had come too late to do the old people any good, that had he come sooner, when the first white traders came, the Tsimsheans would long ago have been good, but they had been allowed to grow up in sin, and now their sins were so deeply laid that they could not change. Mr. Duncan was about to rise to answer the old man, when he, to his surprise, noticed that Legaic had already sprung to his feet, and with great fervour said, "I am a chief, a Tsimshean chief. You know I have been bad, very bad, as any man here. I have grown up and grown old in sin, but God has changed my heart, and He can change yours. Think not to excuse yourselves in your sins by saying you are too old or too bad to mend. Nothing is impossible with God. Come to God. Try His way. He can save you." In 1869, while on the way down from Nass River, he was suddenly taken ill at Fort Simpson. When he became convinced that he could not live, he sent the following note to Mr. Duncan: "Dear Sir, I want to see you. I always remember you in my mind. I shall be sorry not to see you before I go away, because you showed me the ladder that leads to heaven, and I am on that ladder now. I have nothing to trouble me, only I want to see you." A malignant epidemic was at the time prevalent at Metlakahtla, making it impossible for Mr. Duncan to leave, though a second and third message came in quick succession, and finally this last, which had not been fully completed when the Father called him home: "My dear Sir, this is my last letter to say I am very happy. I am going to rest from trouble, trial, and temptation. I don't feel afraid to meet my God. In my painful body I always remember the words of our Lord Jesus Christ." Here the pen had fallen from the dying man's hand. This was the death of Legaic, once the mortal enemy of Mr. Duncan and of the holy cause he represented. His life is not different from that of many others of the Indians who found a happy, blessed end, thanks to the solace of the Gospel, which Mr. Duncan had brought to them at such sacrifice, and with such infinite labour. It is only his one-time prominent position, and the fact that he, in order to become a Christian, had to give up so much more than many of the others, that entitles him to any special mention. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. Arctander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Onward and upward. The building up of the little village now proceeded at a rapid gait. Before the fall of 1862, 35 houses, averaging 34 by 18, and each with 4 windows, had been erected. Governor Douglas himself gave the windows and the nails for the buildings. Mr. Duncan had built a log house for himself, containing a sitting room, a kitchen, and a bedroom, provided with 2 bunks, so he was even in a position to entertain an occasional guest. He had also, during the summer and fall, erected in time to be able to use it for the first time for the Christmas services in 1862, a large octagonal church. There were 2 roaring fires in the centre, the smoke finding its way up through an opening in the middle of the roof, Indian fashion. The building had no flooring, the people sitting on the bare gravel floor. It could easily hold 700 people, and soon, as more and more every year came to live at Metlakahtla, it was often taxed to its utmost capacity. Both of these buildings were, later on, torn down to give place to the magnificent mission house. Unfortunately, there are no photographs in existence of the 2 pioneer buildings at old Metlakahtla. From its beginning, Metlakahtla became known for its rigid observation of the Sabbath day. It was the first duty imposed by Mr. Duncan on the Indians, in his very first address to them, and he had always continued to insist that it is a Christian's foremost duty to keep the Sabbath day holy, to do no secular work on that day, but to devote it entirely to worship and rest. The Metlakahtla Indians, the name under which his people soon became known all over the coast, not only observed Sunday rigorously when at home, which they could not, of course, very well help, but wherever they went, and no matter how great the temptation might be, they were true to their convictions, and not only abstained from all labor, but made it a point to gather around the Word every Sunday. Bishop Hills, in 1863, after mentioning the excitement attending the short fishing season, and the importance of every hour's work while it lasts, writes, "But what did the Christian Indians do when the Sunday came? The first Sunday of their fishing season, as Christians, although the fish had come up in greater abundance than ever, and the season was so short, the Christians said, 'We cannot go and fish.' The heathen were full of excitement, gathering in the spoils, but the Christians said, 'No, we are God's people. God will provide for us, and we will spend the day as He tells us to do." Mr. Duncan relates an interesting incident which took place some years later. Captain Butler, who was at the time superintending the building of the telegraph lines through the interior of British Columbia by the Western Union Telegraph Company, and who was in a great hurry to get a shipment of wire and other supplies up to the large squad of workmen in the interior, who would all be idle till the materials reached them, came to Mr. Duncan to ascertain if he could furnish him some men to take the supplies up the Skeena River in their canoes, just as fast as it could be possibly done, whenever the materials should arrive on the steamer. "Yes," Mr. Duncan said, "I can get you the men, and very reliable men at that, but they will not work on Sundays." "That is too bad. We are in such a hurry. We have a large force lying idle at the company's expense. Every day costs a small fortune. But get me 24 men and 4 canoes anyway." This was done. When the captain came back with his small steamer, they were ready. The steamer was towing several canoes belonging to some Indians whom he had picked up. When he came by Metlakahtla, Mr. Duncan said, "I have done what you wanted me to. The men are all ready." "I am sorry," the captain answered. "I don't need them now. I have got enough Indians with me who will work on Sunday and every other day." And with these words he started towards Skeena River with his steamer and canoes. The Indians, aggravated at his conduct, sought Mr. Duncan's advice as to what to do. "He has hired you," Mr. Duncan answered, "and has insulted you by passing you by. You had better paddle your canoes the 20 miles, and tell him you are ready to go to work as you agreed." They did so. It was a good thing for Butler, for when he was ready to start his canoes up the river, he found his Sunday and every other day Indians all gone. They had only wanted to get their canoes towed up anyway, and under pretense of getting huffy at some treatment by some of his men, they had all left him in the lurch. He was, therefore, more than glad to get the Metlakahtla Indians under the circumstances. He had some boats manned by white sailors, and he started them all together one Saturday at noon. When Sunday came, the Indians refused to proceed, and tied up their canoes for the day on the river bank. He coaxed and threatened, but it did not help. Then the sailors commenced to taunt and ridicule them, knowing the Indians' weakness on that point. But they stood by their guns, stayed and held their little meeting, while the white sailors pulled on their oars. Monday morning they started in afresh, and before Tuesday noon they came up with the white sailors, and shot past them like a streak of lightning. Now it was their turn to laugh and taunt. They shouted to the sailors that they would tell their friends that they would be coming along by and by. Captain Butler, later on, had to acknowledge that these Indians were the best and most reliable men he had ever had to deal with, and that they always managed to get ahead of those who worked on Sundays. After that, he always tried to get Metlakahtla Indians whenever he could. New Year's Day, 1863, the people of Metlakahtla were to pay their first annual village tax, to wit, 1 blanket, or $2.50 for every adult male, and 1 shirt, or $1, for boys approaching manhood. The proceeds were to be used towards village improvements, that year for the building of a road around the village. Of 130 amenable to the tax levy, only 10 defaulted, and they were excused on account of poverty. The total proceeds of the tax collection was 1 green, 1 blue, and 94 white blankets, 1 pair of white trousers, 1 dressed elkskin, 17 shirts, and $7. It is evident that there were no tax dodgers at Metlakahtla. As to the spiritual condition about this time, Mr. Duncan wrote the Church Missionary Society as follows: About 400 to 600 souls attend divine service on Sundays, and are being governed by Christian and civilized laws. About 70 adults and 20 children are already baptized, or are only waiting for a minister to come and baptize them. About 100 children are attending the day school, and about 100 adults the evening school. About 40 of the young men have formed themselves into 2 classes, and meet for prayer and exhorting each other. The instruments of the medicine men, which have spellbound their nation for ages, have found their way into my house, and are most willingly and cheerfully given up. The dark and cruel mantle of heathenism has been rent, so it can never be made whole. Feasts are now characterized by order and goodwill, and begin and end with the offering of thanks to the giver of all good gifts. Scarcely a soul remains away from divine service, excepting the sick and their nurses. Evening family devotions are common in almost every house, and better than all, I have a hope that many have experienced a real change of heart. Thus the surrounding tribes have now a model village before them, acting as a powerful witness for the truth of the gospel, shaming and correcting, yet still captivating them, for in it they see those good things which they and their forefathers have sought and labored for in vain, to wit, peace, security, order, honesty, and progress. To God be all the praise and glory. In April 1863, Bishop Hills of Columbia came up from Victoria to baptize 57 adults. Before admitting them to the Holy Sacrament, he examined the applicants carefully. He says about this part of the work: "It was a strange, yet intensely interesting sight in the log cabin, by the dim glimmer of a small lamp, to see just the countenance of the Indian, sometimes with uplifted eyes, as he spoke of the blessedness of prayer, at other times with downcast melancholy, as he smote upon his breast, in the recital of his penitence. The tawny face, the high cheekbones, the glossy jet-black flowing hair, the dark glossy eye, the manly brow, were a picture worthy the pencil of an artist. The night was cold. I had occasionally to rise and walk about for warmth, yet there were more. The Indian usually retires as he rises with the sun, but now he would turn night into day if he might only be allowed to have the sign, and to be fixed in the good ways of God." It is exceedingly interesting to read the bishop's description of the church, and of the preparations for the baptism. The impressiveness of the occasion was manifest in the devout and reverent manner of all present. There were no external aids, sometimes thought necessary for the savage mind, to produce or increase the solemnity of the scene. The building is a bare, unfinished octagon of logs and spars, a mere barn, capable of containing 700 persons. The roof was partly open at the top, and though the weather was still cold, there was no fire. A simple table, covered with a white cloth, upon which stood 3 hand basins of water, served for the font, and I officiated in a surplice. Thus there was nothing to impress the senses, no colour or ornament, or church decoration or music. The solemnity of the scene was produced by the earnest sincerity and sincere purpose with which these children of the far West were prepared to offer themselves to God, and to renounce forever the hateful sins and cruel deeds of their heathenism. And the solemn stillness was broken only by the breath of prayer. The responses were made with earnestness and decision. Not an individual was there whose lips did not utter, in their own expressive tongue, their hearty readiness to believe and to serve God. Among those baptized on this occasion was Legaic, the head chief, an account of whose life and death was given in the foregoing chapter. When it has been said, in a publication produced under the Church Missionary Society's auspices, that this absence of all external aids to devotion was the result of circumstances rather than choice, it shows either a total unacquaintance with Mr. Duncan's peculiarities and ideas, or a wilful perversion of facts. From his earliest days, Mr. Duncan had been, shall I say, a most intolerant opponent of everything even smacking of ritualism. No crosses or altars, or vestments, or even lecterns are allowed in any church with which he has anything to do. Every service has to be as rigorously simple and unostentatious as it is possible to make it, and it may well be believed that no bishop or any other priest would be allowed to indulge in any high church frills, like bowing to the east, or having the catechumens kneel before the officiating clergyman, or before any one but God. He simply would not have it. As he once expressed himself to me, he was Bishop of Columbia, but I was Pope of Metlakahtla, so it had to be the way I wanted it or not at all. We, who know Mr. Duncan, can readily affirm that this picture, painted by himself, is not the least bit overdrawn. It should perhaps here be added, in order to explain his position on these matters, that it is due to an honest conviction on his part that it would be absolutely detrimental to the Indian to allow ceremonies, ritual, vestments, and church decorations to be part of his religious devotion, for the reason that he feels assured that, in that case, these outward elements would assume too great importance to him, and that they would, in fact, become his religion, instead of, as it should be, the faith of a repentant heart, and the soul resting, its sins forgiven, in the loving arms of Jesus, the blessed Saviour. It may also at this place be said that as much as he detests forms and rituals and ceremonies in religion, just as cordially he is opposed to emotionalism, and from the earliest times he has discouraged, as much as he could, any phase of religion which would particularly address itself to the emotions of the natives. With him it is, and must be, conviction, faith, and practice, and nothing else. In his sermons it is the head he addresses rather than the heart, and yet he can sometimes be as tender as a woman. The bishop, before he left, on the occasion mentioned just before this digression, gave a feast of rice and molasses to all the village. His description will give a new idea, both of their ways and of their accomplishments. He says, "They assembled in the octagon. Cloths were laid. They all brought their own dishes and spoons. There were 3 tables, at each of which one of the chiefs presided. Their custom is to eat little at the time, but to take away the principal part of the allotted portion. All rise, before and after the meal, for grace. Singing was then introduced, and excellent certainly were the strains of harmony poured forth in the English language. Several well-known rounds were capitally sung. First, a boat song, then, 'When a weary task you find it, persevere and never mind it.' Then, 'Come tell me now, sweet little bird, who decked thy wings with gold?' And last, 'God save the Queen.' In this they were as quick and lively as any children in the world, the men joining too in good time, and with voices sweet and soft. Mr. Duncan afterwards addressed them in an earnest speech." 6 months later, the Rev. R. J. Dundas came to Metlakahtla for the purpose of baptizing 39 more adults and 13 children. In 1866, the bishop again visited the settlement, and then baptized 65 adults on Whitsunday. And in September of the following year, the Dean of Christ Church, Victoria, Mr. Duncan's old and beloved friend, the Rev. E. Cridge, came up and stayed for several weeks, and baptized 96 adults and 18 children. Thus the good work continued. Almost every year from now on an increasing number were baptized, and every New Year's Day a large number of new colonists were solemnly admitted to the privileges of the Christian community. In some years over 100 joined. In this connection it may be said that Dean Cridge, on his visit to Metlakahtla, by his charming Christian disposition, completely won the hearts of the Indians, who after this looked upon him as their best friend next to Mr. Duncan. This was made apparent when Bishop Hills several years later wrote to Mr. Duncan that he intended again to visit Metlakahtla. Some time prior thereto, the bishop had a falling out with Dean Cridge, which occurred in this way. A sacerdotal and ritualistic priest of the extreme high wing of the church had one day, at the bishop's invitation, preached in Christ's Church in Victoria. He gave full vent to his extreme faddish notions, a matter of bad taste, to say the least, as it was well known that the dean was an extreme low churchman. After the sermon, the dean announced that never again, as long as he was dean of Christ's Church, should such a sermon be delivered in that church, an announcement which was received by the congregation with a round of applause. The bishop, who was present, went into a paroxysm of rage, and not only roundly abused the dean in the vestry after the service, but even went to the extent of having him prosecuted before an ecclesiastical court on the charge of brawling in church, a prosecution which ended in the bishop taking away his license. The result of this abominable treatment of Dean Cridge was that not only he, but almost his whole congregation left Christ's Church, and joined the Reformed Episcopal Church, which latter church soon after recognized his eminent qualifications by making him a bishop. This high office he to this day, at the advanced age of 90 years, still fills with that true Christian love and evangelical zeal for which he always has been noted. When the bishop's message came to Mr. Duncan, he, who knew the Indians' feelings in regard to the trouble between the bishop and Dean Cridge, thought it best to lay the matter before a meeting of his church, and to ask the Indians what answer they wanted to give the bishop. It did not take the Indians long to come to the conclusion that they wanted Mr. Duncan to write the bishop, "Let the bishop first become reconciled with Mr. Cridge, and then he may come to Metlakahtla." The letter was sent, but no bishop came. The Indian Christians at Metlakahtla showed plainly enough by their action at this time that they were not persons with cringing knees even before the highest church dignitaries, but reserved their Christian privilege to insist upon Christian conduct and disposition even in the princes of the church. This declaration of independence on their part should have given fair warning to the society and to the church that they were not to be oppressed by any hierarchical domination, but it was not heeded, as will hereafter be made apparent. In fact, it is not unlikely that their open and frank avowal at this time was at least one of the causes of the persecution on the part of the church and state to which they would some day find themselves subjected. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. Arctander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Temporal Advancement. God well knew what he did when he placed a practical businessman as missionary among these Indians. When a Tsimshian became a Christian, he became poorer than when he was a heathen. This statement may seem absurd, but its correctness is easily proven. To become a Christian does not make him a smarter hunter or a more skillful fisherman. In other words, if no new industry is provided for him, his income remains the same as before. Not so with his expenses. When a heathen, his old dirty blanket was sufficient both for a suit and for bedclothes. His wife and children, most of the time, trotted around only half clothed. When he became a Christian, he needed a decent suit to go to church in, and another for his daily work. His wife required a civilized dress, and the children also must be clothed and shod. This meant to him quite an additional outlay. Therefore it was absolutely necessary not only to convert him to Christianity, but also to open to him new sources of industry, new means of earning wages with which to meet the extra demands on his purse. This Mr. Duncan gradually set about doing. To begin with, he paid the Indians wages for their work on his house and on the church. Then they were paid for all work on the public improvements, such as the roads which were being built, the drainage necessary, and later on the building of a public guest house, or market house, where visiting Indians could be housed while staying at the village for trading purposes. 100 garden plots were also laid out on a neighboring island, where some of the old villages had been located, and distributed among the villagers, who thus were enabled to raise all the potatoes they needed for household use. They were also encouraged in preparing salted and smoked salmon, oolakan grease, and dried berries, for exportation to Victoria, and Mr. Duncan made it a point to exhort them to extraordinary efforts to secure furs of all kinds. After a while, he started a soap factory among them, at which cheap soap was manufactured from the oolakan grease, an industry which gave steady employment to several people. But in order to get rid of their articles for export, and to obtain the necessities of life outside of what the ocean furnished them, the Metlakahtla Indians were either obliged to go to Fort Simpson to trade with the company's agents, or encourage the visits of trading schooners, who were at the time a visitation indeed of the coast. To go to Fort Simpson exposed them to the very temptations from which Mr. Duncan wanted to remove them when he took them to Metlakahtla. Several of his people, to his sorrow, while going to the fort to trade, had fallen victims to the temptations there so freely thrust upon them. On the other hand, the trading schooners were practically nothing but grog shops, and their visits to the settlements of the Indians were only too frequently marked by murder and the very maddest of riots. Mr. Duncan, therefore, soon after coming to Metlakahtla, made an earnest effort to have the Hudson's Bay Company open a store in the village, where the Indians could exchange their furs and other produce, and obtain in return, therefore, the necessities of life, without being compelled to go to the heathen hell hole at the fort. The only conditions he imposed were, that no intoxicating liquors should be sold or kept on the premises, that only a reasonable profit should be exacted, and that the agent in charge should be a decent man, who would respect the Sabbath day, and not in any manner throw any hindrance in the way of the Christian and civilizing work carried on in the village. The directors of the company, who did not much fancy the removal of all these Indians from the villages around the fort, refused to grant this reasonable request, and what was more, when Mr. Duncan attempted to induce one after the other of the Christian merchants in Victoria to establish a branch store at Metlakahtla, the Hudson's Bay Company, which at the time was just about almighty on the coast, insinuated to each of them that he might not find it to his interest to take up this enterprise. They therefore, one after the other, backed out, after first having taken very kindly to the proposition. But Mr. Duncan was not a man to be daunted. He knew something about business himself, and what he did not know he could learn, and he concluded to open a store on his own account at Metlakahtla. He could buy furs and other articles from the Indians himself, and ship them to Victoria, and in return sell them what they needed. By being exceedingly careful in saving, he had been able to put away quite a portion of his meagre salary of $500 per annum, which the Society paid him while at the fort, and this small capital would now enable him to purchase and pay cash for a small stock of goods, such as the Indians needed. But he soon ascertained that capital was not the only thing which he required. He was nearly 600 miles from Victoria. His exports had to be shipped out, and the goods that he needed had to be shipped in, and the Hudson's Bay Company steamers were the only means of communication along the coast. He was hardly prepared for their decision that their steamers would not be allowed to carry any freight either to or from Metlakahtla. But when it came, he made up his mind that a little thing like that was not going to balk his plans. He determined to buy and fit out his own schooner, and have the Indians run it up and down the coast. It would give more of them a living, that was all. He laid the matter before the governor in council, who agreed to advance him, from the public funds, $500. The schooner could be bought for $1,500. Mr. Duncan, who wanted the Indians to feel personally interested in the enterprise, persuaded them to take shares of $5 each, to the amount of $400 all told, and the balance he advanced from his own private funds. Soon the Carolina, with a native master and crew, was running up and down the coast, bringing goods for the store up to Metlakahtla, and furs by the ton down, for as soon as the other Indians living outside of Metlakahtla found out that their marten skins, which at the company store had only been worth 25 cents, at Mr. Duncan's establishment brought their possessor from $3 to $4, mink skins, instead of 2 cents, 50 or 75 cents, and sea otters, instead of $10 to $12, $100. They soon found it to their interest to transfer their trade to the new store, and the Carolina now carried a full cargo both ways, and was kept busy running all the time. When at the close of the year Mr. Duncan was able to pay each of the Indian stockholders $5 per share in dividend, they did not like to take the money at first, as they thought they would have to give up their interest in the schooner. But when he explained to them that they still retained their interest just as before, as part owners, and that the sum which he paid them only represented what they had earned on their investment, they almost died. After that, they wanted to rechristen the schooner Ha, a male slave, for, they said, he does all the work and we get all the profits. The Indians evidently do not agree with us as to the gender of a ship. But it stands to reason that the Hudson's Bay Company, which at that time was the Standard Oil Company of the Northwest Coast, not only to say of all Canada, and used to having things pretty much its own way, would not stand for a man like Mr. Duncan, a poor man and a mere missionary at that, interfering in this manner with their monopoly, without trying to make him feel its power. An order was given to overbid him on furs, and to undersell him on goods, which the Indians wanted. He would soon find that it did not pay to play with a concern like theirs. They could well afford to run their business at Fort Simpson for, say, a year, even at an absolute loss if necessary, in order to crush this inconvenient and obstreperous rival. But the company did not reckon with the kind of man Mr. Duncan was. When he heard of these plans of theirs, he went to the company's representative and said to him, "I have heard what the company has concluded to do, and I am perfectly willing to have you carry out its orders. I do not fear you, and I will tell you frankly how I will act in the matter, so that you may take your measures accordingly. My goods are all paid for, and it will not break me if I do not sell a pound or an ell of my stuff. The moment I find that you raise the price of furs above a fair living price, or lower the price of goods below a fair profit, I will turn the key in the lock of the door of my store, and not sell another article. When the Indians come for goods or with furs, I will send them to you, and tell them that they can make a good profit by coming to the fort. But mind you, you will have to keep on with your plan and your prices. For the moment I learn that you have come down on the furs, or have come up on your store goods, I will open the door of my store again, and tell the Indians to come and trade with me once more, that I can do as well as you with them. And considering the way they feel towards you, I think I will be able to get them to do just about as I tell them. Now, honestly, what do you think about my plan?" Captain Lewis evidently did not think much of it, for the Hudson's Bay Company's order was revoked, and for the first time in its history, this purse-proud and powerful company had to acknowledge a defeat in its great trade of the Northwest Territory. And what was more, not only did the directors conclude it was good policy not to balk Mr. Duncan in his enterprise, but within another 6 months they notified him that they would be able to ship his freight on their steamers from that time on, if he desired to sell his schooner. This he did, obtaining a cash price of $1,000 for it. Of course, he paid back to the provincial government its proportionate part of the proceeds of the sale price. Undoubtedly a surprise for the government, which naturally never had expected to get back a cent of any money advanced to a missionary. Never was a victory more complete. The profits of the trading establishment at Metlakahtla were largely applied to public improvements of all sorts, and to such new enterprises as promised to give employment to the people at their own home. Very soon a blacksmith's shop was started. Then a carpenter's shop followed. At an early day, Mr. Duncan had told the Indians that he would teach them how to make water saw lumber for them. When he first came to Metlakahtla, he had in mind a fine water power not far away. When the water wheel had been put in position and a sawmill started, one of the Indians came to him and said, "I want to die now." "Why do you want to die?" "Oh, I want to go and meet our old chiefs and tell them the wonder I have seen, that you have made water saw wood. They never heard or saw anything like that while they lived, and I want to be the first one to tell them." He sat down on his haunches a whole day by the mill, and seemed to take in everything intensely. Strange enough, he did die a short time afterwards. Some years later, Mr. Duncan, discovering some suitable clay near by, started a brick kiln, which soon made all the bricks they needed for their chimneys, and considerable for export to other camps. After he had been at Metlakahtla a short time, Mr. Duncan concluded that it would be well to give the prominent Indians some share in the government of both the village and the church. He therefore appointed a number of natives to be members of a village council, to which council, together with the constables, whose number now had been increased to 20, he gave an advisory voice in relation to all village affairs. Of course, Mr. Duncan naturally reserved to himself the final decision of all matters, while he, with great urbanity, listened to all they had to say on any question, and generally followed their advice. He also appointed such a number as he, from time to time, deemed proper to act as elders of the church. After a while, he thought he would try the experiment of having them elect their own village council and elders. His first experience convinced him that he could fully trust them. An elder was to be elected. He called into the council chamber the leading men of the village, and told them that as they knew their fellows in daily life, and when away from the village, he had made up his mind to have them vote for whom they thought would be the best man for elder. He announced the mode of election to be as follows. He would go into the next room. Then one of them at a time could come in there and tell him whom he wanted to vote for. The first man in voted for Silas, the next one also. He was very much surprised to see that Silas had a great majority of the votes cast. He himself had never thought much of Silas. He was a quiet, reserved man, who never had much to say or testify. When the election was over, he told them of his surprise at Silas receiving such a vote, and asked them how it came about. They said, "You don't know him. He is so quiet here. But when he is out at the fishing stations on Sundays, he always gathers the people around him, and prays, and speaks, and exhorts, and does a great work, greater than any one of us." And thus Mr. Duncan found it to be. Silas proved to be one of his best men, and still he had never suspected it. Later on, Mr. Duncan got up another mode of election. At that stage, very few of the electors could write, so they could, of course, not vote by ballot. He wanted to get a perfectly free expression, and let every man have a secret vote. This is how he arranged it. Mr. Duncan nominated a certain candidate. Every elector was furnished with a button. Then Mr. Duncan took a deep hat, and passed it in front of them all slowly. When the hat was before him, the elector was instructed to put his hand in which he held the button, way down to the bottom of the hat. If he had any objection to the man he proposed, he should drop the button in the hat. If he was favourable, he should withdraw the hand, retaining the button in it. Once a certain man had been proposed for elder. When the ballot was closed, there was one button in the hat. Mr. Duncan told them that while one button would not defeat an election, he wanted to know if there really was an objection, or whether the button had been dropped by mistake. So he said, "I will pass the hat again." Everybody put his hand in again. If the one who dropped his button let it fall by mistake, he can pick it up again when he puts his hand in. The hat went around again. The button was still there. There evidently was no mistake. Mr. Duncan had never heard aught against the man nominated, and was anxious to know whether the black ball was due to spite. So he said, "I don't want to declare this man elected now. Let the man who dropped this button come to my office tomorrow sometime, and tell me why he did so." The next morning, very early, before he was out of bed even, he noticed a man walking back and forth in front of his office. He opened the door. "Well, what do you want?" "I am the one who dropped that button." "Ah, you had good grounds for it, I suppose." "I will tell you, and you can judge for yourself. He and I were at the store together one day. He paid for some goods. By mistake, he got $1 too much in change. After a while, he showed it to me, and asked me if he should give it back to the storekeeper or keep it. I told him to give it back, and he did. But I thought that a man who did not know enough to be honest was not fit to be an elder of the church. That man was not declared elected, though there was only one button against him. Later on, this mode of election proved too slow. Another course was then adopted, by which 10 men could be elected in half an hour. The electors were stood up, with their faces to the wall, all round the room, and told not to look around. When a man had been nominated, any person who was opposed to him was told to put his closed fist behind his back. If favourable, the open hand. Sometimes Mr. Duncan, who of course was the sole judge of the election, saw a closed fist move very violently behind some back. 10 or more closed fists defeated the candidate nominated. At the present time, when all the electors are able to read and write, the election is by ballot every New Year's Day. It is, perhaps, unnecessary to say, inasmuch as Mr. Duncan is a confirmed bachelor, that there is no female suffrage, and never has been any at Metlakahtla. What is more remarkable, perhaps, is that there are no suffragettes either. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla, by John W. Arctander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Shempf. Interesting incidents. The Hymas of Duncan's time was sick. His brother, Womaquat, came after Mr. Duncan. This was while he still resided at Fort Simpson. When he came near the house, he found out that a medicine man was in there, working upon him. The women outside tried to persuade him to go by, and not enter the house, as he would disturb the work, but he boldly entered at the front door. Hymas was wholly naked in a very cold room, and the medicine man was rattling away over him for dear life. When Mr. Duncan came up, the medicine man blew off steam and quit his work. Mr. Duncan took the man's pulse, and found him in the midst of a severe chill. He saw that it was necessary to restore his circulation if he should not die then and there, and ordered him covered up quickly with many blankets, and placed close by the fire. He then took the brother along with him to the fort, and gave him some medicine for the sick man. Hymas recovered. 2 or 3 years later, Hymas came with his people to Metlakahtla from Victoria. Mr. Duncan heard that he had whiskey in his canoe, and sent for him, but as he was not a magistrate at the time, he could only give him a tongue-lashing. He abused him roundly for bringing fire-water among his people and corrupting them, so that they would go back to their old savage state. He answered sullenly that he did not want to be a white man. He only wanted to be an Indian and retain the customs and ways of the Indian. He was at the time dressed in a pea-jacket. If that is so, Mr. Duncan answered him promptly, you should be consistent. You should carry the blanket of an Indian, and not go around with a white man's good coat on your back. This must have taunted him, for with a violent movement he tore off the coat, and threw it at Mr. Duncan's feet, saying that he wanted nothing belonging to the white men, and that Mr. Duncan could keep it. With this he rushed out of the house. An hour or so later his wife came in, and commenced to abuse her husband in every way. Hymas is such a big fool. He has no sense at all. He is a very foolish Indian. He don't know what he is doing. I am very much ashamed of him. You must forgive him. What is it you want? It was the coat she wanted. Mr. Duncan told her, take it. I don't want it. It still lies where he threw it. I have not touched it. She picked it up triumphantly and went out, evidently very well satisfied with the results of her diplomacy. One day, while Mr. Duncan was on a visit in Victoria, an Indian from the reservation near by had shot at a man, standing close by the mast of a schooner, just as it passed out of the harbour, and while he missed the man, the bullet had hit the mast. The next day, the chief of police met Mr. Duncan on the street, and told him about the incident, and said that he did not know how to secure the arrest of the Indian, inasmuch as they did not even know his name. As Mr. Duncan told him that he thought he might help them in the matter, the governor, later in the day, sent for him, and asked his advice. He unfolded a plan, which afterwards was successfully carried out. The next day, at 1:30 p.m., Mr. Duncan was to go to the reservation, gather the Tsimsheans together, find out from them who did the shooting, and try to persuade the Indians from taking the guilty man's part. This he did, and found that Cushwaht was the guilty party, and that he was hidden in a hide-a-house near by. The reader will, perhaps, remember Cushwaht as the Indian who had volunteered to kick Mr. Duncan's head on the beach the day Legale was going to make an attack on him in the schoolhouse. Also as the same man who had smashed the lock of the schoolhouse door, and who had threatened to kill Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan told the Indians that Cushwaht had committed an outrage, which the white men could not overlook, but that they only wanted Cushwaht, and would not harm any other Indians, if they did not interfere in the matter. This was so much contrary to their idea of law and procedure that they seemed unwilling to believe it, thinking that the government would be sure to take its vengeance on all of them. Mr. Duncan, in order to satisfy them that they were wrong, offered to stay among them as a pledge of good faith. In this way he kept them apart, behind a mound, some distance from the house where Cushwaht was hidden. When the smoke from the gunboat appeared, the Indians made a rush away from him, but he called them back. And when the Red Jackets came marching up, there was another rush away, but he called them back again, and succeeded in quieting them. The governor then asked him to call on the Haidas to surrender the man, but they refused. After he had repeated their answer, he, by request, returned to them, and told them that the governor gave them just 10 minutes in which to surrender the man. If they did, no harm would come to any one of them. But if they did not, the troops would charge on them, and they would probably all be killed. Still no move. He held his watch in his hand. When there was 1 minute left, he told them, "You had better produce him now. If you don't, I am afraid you will be sorry." Just as the time was up, they brought Cushwaht out, and turned him over to the military. They were going to take him to jail, when Mr. Duncan protested to the governor, and insisted that the man should be flogged publicly, as the Indians cared nothing for jail. This was done, and Cushwaht was thereupon committed to await his trial. It seems that in those days of primitive justice, even a governor and a magistrate did not consider it out of the way to punish a man first, and try him afterwards. It was, perhaps, the only safe course to take with the Indians. Some days afterwards, the jailer came and told Mr. Duncan that there was an Indian in jail who would like to see him. He went in, and found that it was Cushwaht. He sat in his cell, looking very dejected and gloomy. When he saw Mr. Duncan, he said, "I was bad to you. You pitied me. You did not punish me. Pity me now. Save me." "If I do, will you promise to be a better man?" "I will. If you will get me free, you shall never find any fault with me. Pity me." Mr. Duncan went to the governor, and pleaded for the poor fellow. As he had not injured anybody, the governor set him free, on condition that Mr. Duncan would vouch for his good behaviour. This he did. Cushwaht went home right away in his canoe, and when Mr. Duncan, a short time afterwards, returned to Metlakahtla in the steamer, Cushwaht at once reported to him, and assured him of his complete allegiance. After that day he became a good Indian, and was always loyal to Mr. Duncan. Though he never moved away from Fort Simpson or became a Christian, he often attended public worship, and seemed to be a very respectful hearer, if not a doer of the word. There is a sad story connected with the life of Simeon Johnson, the man on the lower row, farthest to the reader's right, in the illustration on a nearby page, Mr. Duncan's Pioneers. He was a murderer. It was discovered in this way. When Mr. Duncan had been but a few years at Metlakahtla, a man came very late one night to his house. He asked him what he wanted, as he was a little suspicious, and never knew what moment some one might come to kill him. "I want to talk with you." "Why do you come so late?" "It is about a great secret." "All right, come in then," he told the man, still watching him very closely. After a while he confessed that he and 2 other Indians had one day, several moons ago, away south, met a canoe with 2 white men, who had been good to them and given them biscuits. At the command of Sabasa, a mighty chief of the Kitrathalas, who was one of the 3, they shot and killed the white men, and took their effects. One of the Indians had since died, and this one now feared the same fate. He had heard Mr. Duncan preach, and knew now that he had done a great wrong, and his friends, with whom he had talked about it, had advised him to come to Mr. Duncan and tell him all. What to do, Mr. Duncan did not know. He advised the fellow to say nothing to anyone about it till he heard from him. He then wrote the Attorney General in Victoria, who advised that the matter be dropped, as they could not convict, inasmuch as there were no witnesses, etc. Mr. Duncan thought it was too bad to take this course, as it certainly would encourage the Indians to kill more white people, but he was obliged to let the matter rest. Some time later, when the Gold Commissioner for the Interior, who was a magistrate, came to Metlakahtla for a visit, Mr. Duncan talked the matter over with him. They agreed to act together, and arrest the murderous chief. Mr. Duncan sent his constables after Sabasa. They performed their duty and brought him into court. He was a haughty, self-important fellow, with 2 slaves supporting him, one by each arm. Other slaves brought a feather bed into court for him to sit upon. His wife also accompanied him into the Hall of Justice, as did a number of his retainers. When the charge was read to him, he said he was not the only Indian who had killed white men. Who are they? He then related how 4 or 5 Indians, some years ago, had killed 5 white men in a canoe, 80 miles south of there, and gave their names. The court was adjourned. Warrants were issued for the other Indians. They were arrested, and an examination was held over all of them. They all fully confessed their murderous deeds. Simeon Johnson was one of the last batch. The magistrates committed them all for trial, and sent them down to Victoria. When the time for the term of court came, Mr. Duncan was summoned to go down. The Attorney General told him that he could not prosecute them for murder, as he did not know the names of the murdered men, and besides, there was no evidence except their own confessions, which were not sufficient to convict upon. Mr. Duncan said, "That is too bad. If you let them go, no white man's life will be safe among the Indians. They must get a healthy respect for the law, and feel that their evil deeds will be punished. If you do not prosecute and convict them, you will have to be responsible for the consequences to all of us white men who live up there. I could perhaps change the charge to piracy on the high seas, with violence. All right. I do not care what the charge is if they are only punished." One of the directors of the Hudson's Bay Company, who was anxious to curry favour with the Indians, told Mr. Duncan that he would get them to plead not guilty, and get them a lawyer, and that if they did so, they could not be convicted. Mr. Duncan tried to convince him of the moral wrong he would be guilty of if he did so, but all to no purpose. Just before the court was to open, Mr. Duncan went into the jail to see the Indians. "Has anyone seen you?" "Yes." "Who?" "One of the company men." "What did he say?" "He said we should say we did not do it." "Are you going to do that?" "No, we will tell the truth." "That's right. That's the way to act. You do that when you get into court, and I will do the best I can for you." When called into court, Mr. Duncan interpreted and explained the charge to them, and asked them, "Did you do this?" They all nodded, hung their heads, and said, "Yes, we did." "Enter a plea of guilty," said the judge, Sir Matthew Bigby, whereupon he delivered a long speech to the Indians, which was interpreted by Mr. Duncan, and finally sentenced them to be hanged. "But," said the judge, "many snows have fallen over our white brother's blood, and your friend, Mr. Duncan, tells me that you were ignorant, and did not know what bad things you did. So I will consult with the other white chiefs, and see if they can make your punishment lighter." He laid the matter before the lieutenant governor in council, with the result that the sentence was commuted to imprisonment for life, but on the condition that they should serve their term at Metlakahtla. They were then, by the court, handed over to Mr. Duncan, with the understanding that they should live at Metlakahtla, and have the freedom of the village limits, as long as they behaved themselves, but when not, to be turned over by him to the proper authorities for life imprisonment. He took them along. Simeon Johnson and the man who came to Mr. Duncan at night and confessed, became good, earnest Christians, and later on went along with him to New Metlakahtla. Sabasa, in a way, sought to be a better man, but had considerable difficulty in conquering his haughty spirit. When Bishop Ridley tried to get a foothold against Mr. Duncan, and drive him away from Metlakahtla, this convicted murderer and the ticket of leave man was one of the chiefs whom he numbered among his few adherents. Sometimes it might, of course, be desirable to get some evil-minded or evil-doing man out of town. Mr. Duncan had a way of accomplishing this without violence, which occasionally might prove dangerous, and cause bloodshed. In the centre of the village, close to the mission house, was, after the first 5 years at Metlakahtla, located a bastion, an octagonal building, the lower part whereof was used for a jail. The upper part formed a balustrade, and was provided with a tall flagstaff, on which, on festive occasions, the English colours were hoisted. When a bad man was desired to leave town, Mr. Duncan hoisted on this flagstaff a black flag, showing that there was a public enemy in the camp. The man who was offensive knew well enough who was meant. Usually the people knew it too. If they did not, Mr. Duncan let a few trusted ones know who it was. That was enough. In a few moments public opinion was aroused. As soon as they saw the flag, the tongues commenced to wag. If any one met the man, he would look at him askance. Some one might say right to him, "You better get out of here. We don't want you." This was sufficient. No one could resist the public and general scorn and abhorrence which the black flag indicated. In one instance only was the black flag not sufficient to drive a devil out of town. He was a chief, who had just succeeded to his rank, upon the death of his old uncle, Metlakahtla, the old head chief of the Kitlans, and now was anxious to show what he could do, perhaps in order to do justice to the old adage that new brooms sweep clean. There were 40 or 50 of his tribe at Metlakahtla. He was a surly, disgruntled fellow. One Saturday night he called a secret meeting of the members of his tribe, at which he railed about how their old, time-honoured customs were being abolished, their old, proud memories disgraced, and their warlike and brave family traits eradicated, and then exhorted them to go back to the old feasts, joys, and pleasures. No one said anything. Not a single man expressed disapproval of what he had said. Mr. Duncan learned of the meeting Sunday morning. This looked very much like mutiny. Heroic measures were evidently required, and that at once. He made up his mind that he must have that chief out of town before service, or no one could tell where it might end. So he hoisted the black flag at once. Oh, what a talk it started! Who can it be? He called 2 constables, and told them to go at once and tell the chief to take his canoe and get out of there before 11 o'clock. The black flag was not sufficient in this case. It meant, "There is no one with you. You are our enemy. We are all down on you." This man had an idea that so long as no disapproval was voiced at the meeting, he was backed by a certain element in the town, that public opinion was not against him. The black flag did not tell the truth as to him. He therefore refused to go. Mr. Duncan now stepped out in front of his cottage with his revolver in his hand. He stood where the man could plainly see him, and told the constables, "Go over and tell him from me that in 10 minutes by the watch his canoe is to be hauled down, and he on his way out. If not, I will meet him face to face, and one of us, perhaps both, will die." Inside of 5 minutes the chief's belongings were brought down to the beach, his canoe pushed off, and he went on his way. The black flag came down. Nothing was said by Mr. Duncan about the affair that day. On Monday he sent for all the men who had been present at the chief's meeting, and gave them a straight talk. "I hear you have been at the meeting of the new chief of your tribe, and that he talked bad, and that none of you showed any disapproval of what was said. Now I want to know what impression this talk made upon you. If you want to go, you are at liberty to do so. You are also welcome to stay. But one thing I want you to know. I want no one who is dissatisfied here. Therefore, speak out plainly. There will be no ill feeling about it. All I want is a clear understanding." One of them, an old man, arose and said, "It is true we were at the meeting, all of us. We heard what Metlakahtla said. It made no impression on us. He is gone. That is well. We do not want to go away. Not one of us." Several got up and expressed the same sentiments. That was the end of that meeting and of the incipient mutiny. Metlakahtla came back a year later. promised to behave himself, and was allowed to live at Metlakahtla. What I am now going to relate happened at a later day, but it comes properly under Interesting Incidents. The sawmill at old Metlakahtla being quite a distance from the store, a telephone line was installed between the two places. This was many years ago, when telephones were still in their infancy, and when the same instrument did service as a receiver and transmitter. One could not hear and speak at the same time, but had to put the instrument to the mouth and speak, then lift it to the ear to catch the answer. An old Indian thought that Mr. Duncan had made a mistake in putting up such an arrangement, as, in his opinion, he ought to have something that could speak the Tsimshean language. It may, perhaps, talk English, he said, but I am sure it cannot talk Tsimshean. Just remember how long it took you to learn our language. You only put that thing up a few days ago. How can you expect it to have learned Tsimshean so soon? I want you to try it, said Mr. Duncan, who took hold of the transmitter, and said to John Tate, who was at the other end of the line, "Lamlahaga is here. I want you to say something funny to him over the phone." He then handed the instrument to the Indian, who took hold of it as if he was afraid of it, but finally managed to put it to his ear. Then he suddenly dropped the receiver. "Indeed, it can talk Tsimshean, and it can talk nonsense too," he said, and fled. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Apostle of Alaska. The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. Arctander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Shempf. How Mr. Duncan Became a Judge. In the early days, there lived at Karta Bay, in Russian Alaska, a Russian trader by the name of Charles V. Baronovitch. Baronovitch, who was married to a Tlingit woman, was a sharp, smart, unscrupulous man, and not at all particular about how he made his dollars, if he only made them. It did not bother him in the least if he got the best of the Indians in a trade for furs, by giving them some firewater, although he of course knew well that it was not only against the law, but extremely dangerous, especially to all white men who came in their way while they were under its influence. Baronovitch had a fine schooner and traded all the way from Victoria to Sitka. One day, in the early spring of 1863, he came with his schooner into the harbor at old Metlakahtla. Mr. Duncan heard a report that he had liquor on board. He took his canoe and went aboard the schooner, but he first posted his Indians on the beach, and told them, if he waved his hand, to at once take their canoes, board the schooner, and put her on the beach. When on the deck of the schooner, he told Baronovitch that he had no objection to his trading with the Indians, but that he did not allow any liquors at Metlakahtla, that he had heard he was dealing in them, and had them on board, and that before he allowed the Indians to trade with him, he wanted to search the schooner for liquors. Baronovitch wanted to know what authority he had for such a proceeding, to which Mr. Duncan answered, "Authority? I have no authority, sir, except the authority of self-defense. My life is in the hands of these Indians. They are my friends now. But if you take away their reason, I will have nothing to defend my life with, and I am going to prevent you placing my life in jeopardy if I can." "How?" "Do you see those Indians on the beach? They are only waiting for a signal from me. The moment they get it, they will rush aboard this boat, overpower your crew, beach your schooner, and burn it with all its contents. They will do it at one word from me. They are obedient to me now. If they get liquor, they will serve the devil and not me, and the first thing he will tell them to do may be to kill me. Will you let me search your schooner peaceably, or shall I give those men the signal?" He consented. Nothing was found. It was probably hidden away pretty well. In any event, he solemnly agreed not to sell any liquor, and shortly after he left. Later on, he went to Victoria, and complained to Governor Douglas of the high-handed outrage which Mr. Duncan had subjected him to. Governor Douglas wrote to Mr. Duncan, and told him that he suspected he had taken the law into his own hands, but that he did not censure him for it, and in order that he might not have to do it again, but have legal authority to protect himself, The governor enclosed to him a commission as a justice of the peace, with jurisdiction over 500 miles of the coastline of British Columbia, and over all the islands of its extended archipelago as well. It is perhaps the first time in history of the world that a man has been made a judge and a conservator of the law on account of having broken that law himself. The governor certainly knew what he did. The very life of the Commonwealth depended on the suppression of the unlawful liquor traffic with the Indians of the coast, and he well knew that no more fearless man could be found in the North Country than the little English missionary, and that he would see to it that the accursed traffic was manacled and stopped. It did not take many years after Mr. Duncan had the governor's commission as a magistrate in his pocket before his name became a terror to all evildoers anywhere along the coast, as far as his jurisdiction extended. In less than 10 years, the unlawful liquor traffic with the Indians had practically ceased. It may be that at times all the forms of law were not strictly observed in his court, that all the technicalities were not always given the seat of honor, that sometimes the evidence did not go in according to all the many hair-splitting rules of lawyers and textbook writers, that the information filed against a prisoner might not always, in every particular, be according to the best established rules of pleading. But who will have the heart to blame this rugged magistrate for brushing aside the web of technicalities and hair-fine distinctions, which perhaps has been the means of defeating justice oftener than maintaining it? He was there to do substantial justice, and he did it as he saw it. His aim was, let no guilty man escape, and none escaped. If the evidence was sufficient to create a moral conviction of a man's guilt, who will blame him for convicting the prisoner if it did not always come up to the utmost requirements of all the technicalities of the law, especially as his knowledge of these technicalities was very limited? The fact remains that not a single one of his decisions was ever reversed on appeal to higher courts. One charge can certainly not be laid to his court. It cannot be said that the court played with justice, and let the offender off with a punishment so light as to make the proceedings a farce. I believe it is the proud record of Judge Duncan that only in one single case did a convicted liquor seller get anything but the very highest punishment which the law allowed. I cannot deny myself the pleasure of devoting a few pages to showing how justice was dealt out to offenders in the High Court of Metlakahtla between 1863 and 1885, when Mr. Duncan presided as its Chief Justice. But before that is done, must be related the circumstances under which Baranovich and Mr. Duncan met again. Several years later, the captain of a south-going steamer from Sitka came ashore at Metlakahtla and asked Mr. Duncan if he had any brandy on hand. Mr. Duncan informed him he always kept some in his dispensary for medical purposes. "Oh my," said the captain, "I wish you would let me take some. Baranovich is on board. He is dying. The only thing which can keep him alive till we get to Victoria is the administration of stimulants, and I do not want him to die on the way. Would you let me have it?" Duncan did. What a sight! The great temperance apostle of the coast, the terror of all whiskey sellers, furnishing the most notorious illegal liquor vendor with the brandy which he needed to keep him alive on his last journey, for he did really live till he reached Victoria, but died a few days after arriving. Last Decoration Day I saw at Metlakahtla Baranovitch's Indian wife, who was on board the steamer with him at the time just mentioned. She came up to Mr. Duncan and shook his hand as cordially as if he had been her best friend. I think he probably was. I am told that she was overheard at this time to say to Mr. Duncan that her husband always spoke of him as one of the greatest men he had ever met. Baranovich was a discerning man. End of chapter 25.